Hello and welcome back to the podcast. For those of you who are new around here, my name is Ruth and I started this podcast to amplify the voices of women in leadership, to talk about what we do beyond the school gate, the good, the bad and the funny. And today's episode is called I Was Triggered. And the reason I wanted to I'm starting up here today, wow, I'm on fire. The reason I wanted to call this episode I Was Triggered, not for clickbait at all. I'd never do that, anything like that. Do you know what I mean? But it was to I heard a quote that said, your family gave you your triggers, so they know how to push them. Like they gave you your buttons, so they know which buttons to push, right? And I just thought that's so interesting. That then sent my mind spiraling, and then reflecting on a number of different conversations that I've had with people over the last few months. And I just kept coming back to the question around values. I know that people can be triggered and we all have different triggers for different reasons, and that's fine, and that's okay. Definitely not here to judge and have an opinion on that. God knows I got a million and one triggers. But when I think about the things that trigger me, it's things that link back to my values. Does that make sense? So I've been having a few coaching conversations with people over the last few months, and we've been talking about like things that we'll tolerate in a workplace and things that we won't tolerate in a workplace. And one of the things that really stands out for me is that the things that people are saying are triggering them are things, when you drill down deeply, they're things that are contradicting their personal values, or they're being asked to put their values to a side and do something or agree to something or operate within a framework that doesn't feel authentic or genuine, if that makes sense. And I just thought it's so interesting. I'd kind of started to connect the dots in those conversations to that phrase of you can be triggered and know your triggers. Know your triggers, because that's really powerful, because then you take some of the power back. If I know the things that trigger me, then I can take steps to either avoid it, or when I am feeling triggered, own it. And I will do that. I will say, I'm in this moment in my head, I will say it, I'm feeling triggered. I will say it, because I think it's really important that you own it. I then sometimes use the snow globe method. So somebody does something or says something, I'm feeling triggered, I tell myself, so I'm fully aware. And then I do the snow globe, which is, imagine somebody is triggering you for whatever reason, and just imagine them within their own little snow globe. You know, the snow globes you get at Christmas time, and there's like, I don't know, a snowman in it, and you shake it up and all the snow goes around. Showing my age, I used to love those when I was a kid. Imagine that person in there doing all the things that they're doing. So if it's the way that somebody behaves, or if it's the way that somebody talks, or if it's the way that, as in like the way they talk to you, as in like they're rude, or they're spreading gossip, or they're being mean, or they're shouldering work and they're trying to give work to everybody else so they don't have to do anything. All those things that trigger me, which always come down to a sense of justice, for the most part, justice and kindness. Anybody who's not being kind, and anybody who is not being fair. Those for me are like the biggest triggers for me, because those are personal values for me, right? So I imagine that person who is not being fair, or imagine that person who's not being kind, in their own little snow globe, and they're spitting out all their body language, or their verbal communication, or their emails, or however they're demonstrating those things that conflict with your values. I just imagine them in a snow globe. And no matter how much they do it, they can't get out of the snow globe. It's just bouncing off the glass back onto them. It actually can't touch you. So I try and look at, if I do feel triggered, I try and do the snow globe effect, because I think that really, for me, really puts things into perspective, that this is such a small thing, and that person is going through whatever they're going through, and they're behaving how they're behaving for a specific reason. My next thought in that process is that not everybody has to be a villain in your story. So because that person's behaving like that doesn't mean that they're the villain in my story. It could mean that they have a different value set to me. It could be that both things can exist at the same time. doesn't mean that mine are right and that theirs are wrong. It means that these two things can exist at the same time, and your value set are this, and that demonstrates these sets of behaviors, and you don't have kindness or justice as a value. You may have something that's a bit more, I know I sound a little bit judgmental here, and I'm going to own it. Something like, I don't know, like power might be a value for you, or control, or something that for me is like, oh my God, like that for me is not something that like resonates with me. It's just not my heart. That's just not who I am. But it doesn't make theirs wrong and mine right. They could look at mine and be like, wow, kindness, woo, that's a bit fluffy. Woo, justice, that's a bit fluffy. Well, Ruth, the world is not fair. There is no justice in the world. Like, they could look at my values and be like, this woman lives in a completely different world. So when I do feel triggered, I always think, our behavior a lot of the time comes from our values or experiences that we've had in life as well. And I try and kind of put it in that order. So if I go through those processes of owning, snow globing, nobody has to be the villain. Sometimes there's situations where no one's the villain. Sometimes I'm the villain. How about that? Do you know what I mean? Or maybe you are the villain, or maybe there's no villains. I think that there's always somewhere in the middle. And I think sometimes when we're feeling triggered, it's so easy to be like, that person triggered me. And Ahmed always says, when every now and then I have a bit of a rant, I know, so out of character for me, I know, right? Would never normally do that, you know. He says, Ruth, offence is taken. It's not given. So if I've taken offence to something he said, you've taken offence to that. I didn't give you offence. And I'm like, yeah, that's so true. So I think going through that thought process for me helps me when I am feeling triggered. And then by the time I get to the end of that thought process, my brain then tells me that you've spent however long going through that process. This is really not that serious. It's not that serious. It's not. Like, it's okay. That's fine. So I kind of tend to just go through that process and then think to myself, is this going to matter in 6 months' time? And then the other thing I do think about, actually, from a work context, I do think, who else needs to know about this thing? Because I think that behavior that's dictated by your values outside of work, you own that. But I also think organizations have values, and it's not saying that everybody's that personal values has to always align with the organization's values. For me, I work and stay in places where I see there's a good culture and there's a good value, and it's not something that's just plastered on a wall. It's actually something that's lived across everybody in the organization, all the way from the CEO to the other end of the spectrum, maybe like admin staff, reception staff. Like, everybody is on a spectrum across an organization. And I think that as long as I'm seeing the values being lived across all of that, for me, that's my tribe, that's my people. And actually, I am a bit of a hippie, because that, for me, is more important. If I had to rank it, that for me is actually more important than my job title, the portfolio that I hold, and in some respects, the actual doing tasks. Does that make sense? Because I've been in positions where I've had what is my dream job if I was to look at like my team and the portfolio that I had. Because the other thing, like title for me is not like, it's not like, for me, it's not in my top 8, I'd say. It's not in my top 8, it's not important. It is important, but it's not important, if that makes sense. Like, it's in my top 10, but not in my top 8. But for me, I would choose an organization that has great values and everybody's living it, over an organization that and then the doing tasks of that job are not necessarily like up there in my top 5, over an organization where the values are just trash, but the actual portfolio and the doing tasks are within my top 5. So for me, values are so important. So I suppose all that to say, when you're feeling triggered, have a process where you are able to check yourself before you wreck yourself, and then go all the way through that process for you to be able to figure out, like, is this important? And also, what do I need to do to make sure that I'm okay? Because we can't control other people. And if this situation wasn't to change, as in this person and their behavior that's triggering you wasn't to change, what do you need to do and have and be to be okay with this situation? Because you can't control everything. And on that note, I shall see you in the next one. Bye.